Kathleen Dennehy, the former Commissioner of the Department of Correction.
Thank you. I must admit, some colleagues said to me, aren't you a little worried about speaking at an event like this? Frankly, the only thing I was worried about was following Reverend Rivers. Well, each of this morning's speakers has very different particular concerns about the proposed three-strikes bill. My concerns are driven by my first-hand experience within corrections. After all, I spent 34 years in the system, including my time as a warden and at the executive level as deputy commissioner and commissioner. I'd like to make a few general comments about prison growth and cost, and then I'd like to talk about some specifics in the bill. Prison growth and spending are results of ineffective war on drugs and tough on crime policies. I lived through them in the 1980s and the 1990s. I remember when I was a young caseworker at Concord having to leave my office every night so that beds could be moved into the office space. That was the reality back in the 70s. And we're headed back there. The rate of U.S. incarceration outpaces all other countries in the world. We don't like to admit that, but that is the case. Since the 1980s, the U.S. imprisonment rate has more than tripled, and we disproportionately send blacks and Latinos to prison for longer periods of time than at any previous point in our history. The racial disparities alone should be of concern to us all. And also, I know this firsthand, prisons are filled with those who are mentally ill and those with drug addictions in serious need of treatment. Our over-reliance on incarceration comes at a tremendous cost to taxpayers with little or no return on investment. We would not run a business this way with these and accept these results. States overall have increased their corrections budgets by 303% in the last 20 years, according to the Pew Center for the States. This surpasses budget increases in all other categories except Medicaid. It's a budget buster. The economic costs of this incarceration rate are not sustainable, and it leaves less money on the table for education, health care, and other state priorities. Prisons is a very expensive sentencing option, and it should be reserved for those that are in most need of it. In 2003-2004, the GCCR, the Governor's Commission on Corrections Reform, was chaired by former Attorney General Scott Harshbarger. That commission spent much time describing the costs of corrections and in the unintended consequences of mandatory sentences on both reentry and recidivism rates. And I would commend that report to all of you to go back and revisit it, lest we repeat history. My principal concerns with the bill are many, but I'm going to focus in on a couple and really skirt through the overcrowding and the costs because the previous speakers have done so well addressing that. But I want to underscore that the statute as drafted too broadly defines the class of offenders who would now be considered habitual offenders. This could have major unintended consequences, both for individuals and for the system at large, at both levels of analysis. Because there's a potential for low-level offenders to end up serving mandatory maximum sentences intended for the most violent felons. Again, prison is an expensive sentencing option. We should reserve it for those that are the most serious offenders. And I urge the removal of some crimes from subsection B of Chapter 27, Section 5. Some offenses are simply not suitable for inclusion on this list, based upon the lack of seriousness of the actions required to meet the element of the offenses, specifically assault and battery, simple assault. Let's talk about an offender who has been sentenced twice for, let's say, dealing cocaine, and that individual leaves prisons without his drug problems having been addressed. Let's say he goes on to commit an unarmed robbery to support his addiction. This third strike could result in a life sentence for that offender. Again, extending his or her period of incarceration is an expensive option, and it could result in other offenders who have committed fewer but more serious offenses being released earlier. Is that the intent of this legislation? I think not. We need to think twice. We need to have our decisions and policy recommendations informed by data. We need to think twice before we throw the book, specifically the state's checkbook, at this type of offender.
That's right.
We need to distinguish between drug users and career criminals.
That's right.
The Three Strikes bill will have an impact at the system level too. Overcrowding, which you've already heard about, and I won't belabor that point. But the current master plan for corrections does a good job of documenting how every available inch is used to provide housing for inmates, including the loss of much-needed program space. It also impacts the internal allocations of resources. Managers have to manage this system. After all is said and done and the statute is passed and the courts go to work and offenders come in the door, at the end of the day, corrections professionals have to manage these unwieldy systems. Warehousing an increased number of inmates for longer periods of time means less money for in-prison treatment programs. Programs that we know have been demonstrated to work. We already know what needs to be done. We simply lack the will and the resources to make it happen. And I know, having been at the executive level in corrections, in any state in this country, if you examine their state budget for corrections, the vast majority of it goes to personnel costs, and the second major cost is health care. By the time you factor in feeding and linen and security and paper clips and office supplies, there's very little money left, as Leslie has suggested, for in-prison treatment. The addition of many new offenders into the system further curtails the available funding that's on the table. The DOC already has inadequate resources to tackle drug addiction and effective reentry services for those who need it most. Nationally, it's estimated that only 10 to 30% of the offenders who are currently doing time ever get the treatment or programming that they need. So let's not delude ourselves that the programs will appear. They won't, in all likelihood. Another concern of mine is that the mandatory terms, the language, I think to the layman, when you think of mandatory terms, you think of a prescribed length of term. To those who have to manage the system, we think of program restrictions. It translates into what programs the offenders cannot participate in while they were doing those very lengthy terms. And in fact, many of the programs that are proven to reduce recidivism, inmates will be restricted from participating in if they are convicted under this. It makes no sense if we're trying to reduce recidivism. One last issue with the bill, the total lack of discretion that judges will have. Both the Senate and House bills fail to provide an exception to the application of the habitual offender provisions. Judges will not be able to consider the facts of the crime, the nature of the offense, how long ago the offenses occurred, and the history of the individual. Also, judges may not be able to consider mitigating factors associated with the previous 2 strikes. In California, it's a state I'm familiar in that I was one of only 11 former directors who signed the amicus brief for the Supreme Court case. In California, state law permits judges to vacate 1 or more of the prior convictions from considerations as strikes in furtherance of justice. Judges need that kind of discretion. We're at a critical juncture here. We need smarter choices for safe communities. We need to consider all the facts before we advance yet another tough-on-crime piece of legislation. We need a rigorous assessment of the costs and the impacts associated with this. And I urge the legislature to wait for data and analysis and the recommendations of the Criminal Justice Commission before acting. Use this information to weigh various sentencing options and corrections policy options and to locate the scarce resources we need to advance these goals. We should follow the lead of many other states that have already advanced reforms by implementing evidence-based sentencing to control crime and reduce costs, a topic that was addressed at the National Governors Association Sentencing and Corrections Policy Forum just last June. Between 1993 and 1995, 24 states passed some type of sentence enhancement that applies to habitual offenders. At least 16 of them have made notable changes to those laws. They have gone back and amended them. In particular, at least 7 states have eliminated the possibility of life without parole, or they have narrowed the circumstances under which the court could impose that sentence. At least 8 states have created sentencing ranges as opposed to mandatory maximum terms. Here we are 15 years after the initial popularity of 3 strikes legislation took root in this country, and states continue to review and refine their 3 strikes bills. Kentucky has eliminated sentence enhancements for second and subsequent drug possession. Indiana, New Mexico, Nevada, South Carolina, and Texas have all recently eased their state sentencing enhancements for repeat offenders, decreasing the length of stay. In at least 11 other states, the habitual offender laws have been amended to allow some measure of judicial discretion. Some states have managed to legislate significant criminal justice reform with bipartisan support. Michigan, Connecticut, Mississippi, Illinois, Kansas, Washington, New Hampshire, Wisconsin, Nevada, Rhode Island, Colorado, Texas, and South Carolina. And lastly, Oklahoma just completed a massive justice reinvestment initiative, a data-driven, and that's the key, a data-driven analysis of the state's criminal justice system led by the Council of State Governments Justice Center. It was guided by a 20-member bipartisan group of state and local criminal justice stakeholders. We need to do the same. We need to pay attention to evidence-based practice. We need to let facts drive this reform agenda.
That's right.
And once we do, we then need to maintain oversight during the implementation. And at this point, I'd like to put a plug in for Representative Khan's long-filed, long-standing bill for corrections oversight. We need to track it, we need to monitor it so that we have the data when we're faced with critical decisions such as this. At this point, I'd like to introduce Jamie Ayers.